Right, good morning, everyone, and welcome. In case there's anyone new on the call this morning, I'm Judy Trotter. I head up adult education at JW3. And as always, I want to thank you so much for joining us this morning, and especially to our presenter today, Dina Kraft. Oh, don't disappear. There we go. So here we are, 8 weeks into 2024, 5 months since October the 7th. And we still have such a great need to be together as we discovered to connect, to share, both in person at JW3 and online so we can be directly in touch with Israel. So thank you, Dina, for allowing us that connection this morning. Dina is an award-winning journalist, a podcaster and an author. She lives in Tel Aviv, where she's the opinion editor of Haaretz. That's just the top. I'm not going to go on because I want us to hear from Dina, not from me. But also we discovered this week, this is the first time I've actually met Dina. We are in discussion about bringing her to JW3 about the book she's written on Anne Frank, and hopefully that will be in September. So we'll keep you informed about that. So as Dina is very happy to take questions, and actually, like Itai in last year, is happy to hear from you. So I won't mute you this time. I won't say put it in chat. I'll just open it up to questions. And at that point, if you can just look for the icon now. If you put the yellow hand icon up, I can see you very easily, or unmute yourself and I'll call on you. Dina, welcome. It's not an easy task we set you. But please do share with us what's uppermost in your mind this morning. Over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Really good to be with you in London, the city where my parents met and married. So I owe my existence to London. So I'm going to start off with telling sort of a story spun off of the news. On Monday, the report came out that there was a soldier killed on Sunday in southern Gaza, and his name was released. And his name was Seaman Shlomov. He was a 20-year-old paratrooper from Kazakhstan. He came by himself. And I didn't make the connection until yesterday morning. I got news from a woman who worked at the boarding school where he lived when he first came to Israel. It's called Meil Shve'ah. I don't know if any of you have ever been there, but it's in this beautiful pastoral setting in the hills outside of Zikron Yaakov. It was set up first as an orphanage for actually Holocaust survivor children many years ago and run by Hadassah. Anyway, she told me that that Simon, who was only 15 years old when I met him and interviewed him for the story, that was the same Simon who was killed on Sunday in the southern Gaza Strip fighting. And it was one of those moments where you realize that Israel's a very close, there's really very few degrees of separation in this country. And even a lone soldier from Kazakhstan who, I had interviewed years ago and had not been in touch with, all of a sudden, all the memories came back. So I'll tell you a little bit about Simon. He came over from Kazakhstan when he was just 14 years old, totally by himself. And I remember him telling me that he came because his parents and him sat down. Kazakhstan was in very bad, economic straits, and still is, in political straits. And they decided he would have a better life here in Israel. And of course, listening back to the podcast that I interviewed him for, which is called The Branch, which is all about Israelis and Palestinians living together in different ways. And I'll tell you the Palestinian connection in a minute. It broke my heart, to realize that this boy who had come over and was so earnest and so smart and so almost world weary already at 15 when I met him. He'd just come over the previous year. Now had just been killed. And he's an only child. His mother came over from Kazakhstan, and I was sent a videotape of his family in 2 white cars going up the driveway into the boarding school, and along the route, like hundreds and hundreds of children dressed in white to sort of greet his family. And it's a reminder of what happens, in Israel in general when someone dies, and especially, including a soldier. When it's a lone soldier, there's a sort of outpouring of support because, of course, the soldier here has no family. I mentioned that there was a Palestinian connection to the story that I was telling in this farming village / boarding school was the story of Simon and his friend Kirill, who had both come from the former Soviet Union, and another little boy named Taco, who had also come over at 13 from Ethiopia. and they were all living by themselves, far from their families. And they kind of had come together and bonded in all places, the cowshed, the dairy of this school, of this boarding school, which is also a working farm. And the person that led this dairy was a former student himself, and his name was Kareem, and he is an Arab citizen of Israel. And so the story was very much about these three boys and their connection with Kareem, and how Kareem did a lot of work on like preparing them for the future, that he knew there'd be rough patches in the future. These were kids who were from difficult backgrounds, and that he would be helping them, and he was their sort of their mentor and guide. And now I'm imagining, Kareem and these and Kirill and Taco kind of recovering and grieving for Simon. And I'm hoping to be able to make it to the Shiva this week. So I wanted to just sort of bring that in as sort of like, we hear these headlines, we hear these names, another soldier has died, another 27 people were killed in Gaza last night. These people start becoming kind of nameless and faceless to us. We're day 140 of this war, and people are weary. And the stories of woe and grief just keep coming at us. And I think part of the experience of being here in Israel, and I know also as the Jewish community in London, is this is maybe for some of us our first experience in collective grief, and as a journalist who's covered a lot of trauma, a lot of violence, both in the States and in Africa and in Israel, I took a course at Columbia University Journalism School, a fellowship a few years ago on journalism and trauma, and how to be a more sort of trauma-informed journalist. And one of the things they told us, which is really helpful information, was when you're interviewing somebody, remember that their trauma is not your trauma. You can kind of almost put like a yellow rain slicker around you as you're interviewing these people and talking to them, because it's your job as like a journalist to be a first responder, and you have to be able to tell the story. And that is true. But I think since October 7th, we have all in Israel, those of us who live here and care about this place, have been challenged as journalists to be able to do that, to keep that yellow rain slicker on, because the news feels so personal and so intense. And, because we are 140 days into the war, I wanted to also address the sort of abnormal normal that we live in, here in Israel. In Gaza, there is no normal. It's still incredibly, it's full on fear and war. And of course, we're on the precipice of a possible Israeli large attack in Rafah, which is, as many of you know, is the border city on the Egyptian border. And Netanyahu has been threatening to go in there, although there are 1.5 million Palestinians who are sheltering there, and there really is nowhere to go at this point. So one of the things we can talk about also maybe in the Q&A is sort of what are Israel's options in this moment. Netanyahu says on the one hand that this is what's needed to fully uproot Hamas. On the other hand, what would the death toll be like, and would the price be too high and the moral stain too much? But back to the sort of abnormal normal, it's Friday morning in Tel Aviv, as it's the beginning of the weekend, it's the beginning of Shabbat here. And in my neighborhood, as always, in the last few weeks, the cafes are full. And you can almost feel like things are normal. And then you see, on the corner, a massive sign that's like 4 stories high of just the faces of the hostages. And then you go to a cafe itself, and there's a mirror. And in front of the mirror, under the mirror, there's a sign that says, "This could be you." So always in front of mind for people. And, on the Israeli side, of course, is the hostages. I know I was in London actually in October, just sort of towards the end of October. And at that point, I hadn't heard anything about the signs of people being torn down. And I was being a total tourist, and I was trying to get a picture of my son in front of one of the red phone booths boxes. And I said, and all of a sudden I saw this picture torn down, and I was like, "What is this?" And my son and my daughter were like, "Mom, didn't you see this on TikTok?" And I was like, "No, I hadn't yet." And it was really jarring, to see those pictures torn down. And in, every Saturday night, many Israelis we'll see those in Tel Aviv, will come to what's known as Kikar Hatufim, Hostage Square. Many of you maybe have seen photos of it. It's what was once the Tel Aviv Museum of Art Square. Now it's been transformed into like a display of sort of somewhere between, I would say, like a Shiva call and like a public art display. So there is a recreation of a Gaza tunnel. There's one of those long tables that I'm sure you've seen around the world, including in London, of sort of the table set waiting for the hostages to return. There's also booths where people from the different kibbutzim, every kibbutz from the southern border has their own booth, and they speak there, and they have photographs of those who are hostages. I spent some time recently with my friend Michael Bar-Sinai, whose father was among those killed on the morning of October 7th. In his case, he awoke to the sounds of the sirens, to the sounds of something going wrong, went to go help his daughter, who was a single mother, who lived across the kibbutz from where he and his wife lived, took a World War II British Army pistol with him, which was up to date, and he had done target practice on not long before, but that's what he was armed with. And it was still sort of quiet despite the reports of things going on. He made himself a cup of coffee, and he went to the balcony with his cup of coffee in one hand and with his British issued World War II gun in the other, his pistol. And all of a sudden, according to neighbors, he was surrounded by 7 Hamas terrorists, and there was some sort of shootout that ensued. So that is Michel's father, is Yoram Bar-Sinai. He was a very special guy who was an architect and actually helped build the kibbutz Be'eri, many of its buildings, and also did a lot of the architectural designs of many kibbutzim in Israel. And so I was there manning the booth with Michael, and I noted that on some of the pictures there was a black line, and those Michael had put in with a black marker, a black line across the top of the photo to indicate that those were kibbutz Be'eri members who had been kidnapped but had since been killed. So of course, there's this very heavy weight, in the country. And at the protests, there are 2 protests that are going on right now. Usually at 6:30, there's a protest at Habima, although that's now moved to Kaplan Street in recent weeks, and that is the anti-government or call for elections protest. And last week there were even more people than usual, and there were scuffles with the police, and you feel the intensity, you feel the frustration growing. There are calls for this government to step down, as you may know from the polls. Most people are not satisfied with this government and with Netanyahu. Even on the right, does not mean that this country is shifting center or left, but there was a lot of dissatisfaction, of course, with Netanyahu and the government. But on the other side, there's this, just a block over, there's the protest for the hostage families, and that is a much more sort of mournful scene. Also a feeling of desperation in the air. You have hostage families coming to speak every week. Every week their views and their speeches become more and more political, more and more direct to Netanyahu, more and more open about feeling abandoned by the government. And I'm just going to share with you a moment that really moved me from the week before last. It was day 127 at that point. And at the end of the rally, there was a decision to count down days to 127. So together in unison, you had thousands of people saying in Hebrew, Chad, Shtaim, Shalosh, 1, 2, 3. And then, and just sort of the magnitude of the days that had passed grew. And then at 100, the person who was at the top, at the stage sort of shrieked out, Mea, 100, with this like guttural cry. And then at 127, he could barely get the 127 out, and just 127, and then I think he said die, which means enough in Hebrew, and you just felt like this communal anguish kind of like rising from the square into the sky, into the heavens, as it were. And it sort of seemed to me to symbolize both the anguish, but just also this feeling of helplessness, like all the creative art installations that you can have, all the different social media efforts to sort of get people's attention, all the phone calls to the White House, all of everything. Like, we hope that it does something. I think actually the calls to the White House, from what I understand from a friend whose son is among the hostages, does do something. It does add pressure. And in your case, calls to the Prime Minister's office and calls to Parliament, they all do that. I think that where the decision-making sits, that's where the most power can be had. But it is this feeling of like, wow, what is going to be? Wow, I realize I'm speaking more than I meant, and I want to open up to questions soon. I just wanted to also just bring us up to a little bit to date, since I know this is an update. It's hard to say good news on the horizon, but there is talk of progress in the ceasefire talks. There's a sense, we've heard both from Hamas officials and from Israeli officials that there is progress. That's unusual to hear them both agree on anything, that there's some sort of movement forward. think we can thank the Americans for that. They're really, really sitting on both sides hard. Ramadan is coming up in about a month, and there's a real effort to make sure that this war is over by then, and hopefully even before then. As we know, the price will be very high for a ceasefire on the Israeli side in terms of releasing Palestinian prisoners. We're talking about probably hundreds of Palestinian prisoners released. For the 134 hostages who are still inside, of those 134, 30 plus we know are killed according to the IDF. So we have a lot of pressure building and a lot of hope that, of course, the hostages will be released. And there's different takes on it. Some you'll hear in Hostage Square, especially, the voices saying, let's just put a halt to this fighting. The fighting doesn't have to end, but let's just bring them back. I don't think the Americans kind of buy that, though. The idea is for a long-lasting ceasefire, not a temporary one. We also have Biden making a lot of news recently. He has been pushing forward, although not publicly unveiling it. It's been sort of reported by his sort of unofficial spokesperson, Tom Friedman, in the New York Times recently, the Biden doctrine, the Biden plan, which calls for, in short, a long-term ceasefire, essentially an end to the fighting, a return to all of the Israeli hostages in exchange for the Palestinian prisoners, as I mentioned, and some sort of interim regime that would govern and start the rebuilding of Gaza. They want to have what they call a Middle East Marshall Plan and a revitalized Palestinian Authority that would help rule this rule in Gaza. But of course, that is full of its own challenges, as we know. Also, a clear path to a demilitarized Palestinian state based in the West Bank and Gaza, and again with East Jerusalem its capital. Things that we've heard about, since the time of since Oslo days. And also some kind of agreed upon solution to the Arab refugee problem in accordance with the Arab Peace Initiative from 2002. And of course, before, as an opinion editor at Haaretz, one of the things that I was putting out just in the days before October 7th, was that we were very close to an Israeli-Saudi normalization deal. And now then the Saudis were saying they were ready to normalize relations with Israel on the condition that improvements be made in Palestinian lives. Now their condition is only on the condition there's a clear path towards Palestinian statehood. And I'll just leave us, before we open up to questions, with a kind of an angry Joe Biden. Joe Biden is upset with Netanyahu. That frustration has been kind of leaking out in all sorts of different ways. He had a tweet overnight that said that how the Palestinian people are suffering as a result of Hamas terrorism, and that Hamas does not represent the overwhelming majority of Palestinians. And I think that's a direct dig at Netanyahu, who's been trying to sort of make it sound like all Palestinians support Hamas. Interestingly, we had a couple of anti-Hamas protests this week in Gaza. So I think Hamas is beginning to feel a little bit of that heat as well, in ways they haven't before. And also the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, which is devastating. And you have people who are hungry and on the verge of starvation and not getting medications, and all of that. So with that, I will turn it over to you and your questions.
Thank you so much, Dina. It's so much more than I expect. It's just wonderful. Thank you. You've pacing so well. And just before, I've got two very different questions in, which I'll give you, unless David, if you want to give your own, just mute yourself. I just want to mention here, in case I forget at the end, that at the moment our installation to raise the conversation and keep the hostages in mind is a project called Love Locks for hostages, based on the Parisian idea of love locks. And somebody has put this project together. Marcel Noble's done an amazing job, got loads of padlocks. We obviously started with the 136, it was at that point, on the with their names on the bridge, with a lot of publicity. It was on the television, on the news, in all the major papers. And that has really raised the conversation again at JW3. And anybody who wants to do one from abroad, if they just email in, we do one for them. And I was just interested in how we keep this up going. You're absolutely right. Everyone is so tired and depressed, and yet here we are on a Friday morning raising the conversation again. So I'm going to go for David's question first. Do you have a comment on Ehud Olmert's opinion piece in Haaretz on the 22nd of yesterday, headline Netanyahu's messianic coalition partners want all out regional war.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is an important thing to note, because Netanyahu came into power with the help of these far right parties, and he thought he'd be able to ride the tiger, right? He thought he'd be the one in charge. He thought he'd be the one sort of, and I think we have seen that he has not been so much the one in charge. He has definitely kowtowed to them on many, many occasions. What I always keep wondering, though, is like, he still has the power. Like, they would not be in power without him. Like, why doesn't he hold the reins back on them? I think for him, it's a convenient excuse. He sort of uses it with the Americans and also with the Brits and with others. They're like, oh, my coalition, I can only go so far. I can only do so many things. But I think the opinion is an important one, because it's highlighting that these folks, they live in a different realm than I would say most of us in this room, this virtual room. Like, a lot of sort of magical thinking, a lot of sort of like, God will make it so. They don't have much experience in politics. They don't have much experience in the real world. Most of them didn't even serve in the army. I mean, I might remind you that Itamar Ben-Gvir was seen as too dangerous to be in the army, and now he is the Minister of National Security, which I still find absurd every time I have to write those words out. So I think it's an important thing to keep in mind. That they see when they're pushing for the war to go on, their interest is, yes, they want to conquer Gaza. They want to sort of bring in Gush Katif, recreate Gush Katif. Gush Katif, for those of you who not remember, was the name given to the Jewish area of settlement in Gaza, which was, there is no biblical claim to Gaza, unlike the West Bank, there it was very much sort of like a show of force and a sort of presence. It was, it was a pretty consensus issue for most Israelis that Gaza had to be withdrawn from, including the Jewish settlements back in 2005. And I actually was there in 2005. I was living in Gush Katif during the withdrawal in Neve Dekalim, which was the largest of the settlements then. And I'll never forget, I spent a lot of time with this lovely family of Yemenite background, 6 children, lovely, they were just like warm and nurturing parents. They did not themselves, they seemed sort of more spiritual than they were political. And I was shocked. They, like so many families, really didn't believe that the withdrawal from Gaza was going to happen. Why? Because the rabbis kept saying a miracle was going to stop it. A miracle was going to stop it. And the night of the Friday night dinner I spent with that family, the father told the story of the parting of the Red Sea, and that, anything could happen. And the next morning, or later the next day, it was Saturday, he was packing. The whole house was packing. But they didn't prepare their people. So I guess the point of this is, like, you can have these sort of messianic sort of leaders, but they really do such a disservice to their people at the end of the day. And this family had to get evacuated from their home, but they hadn't been they were not mentally prepared for it, and they're not physically prepared for it. But that is very much what, the sort of the extreme right messianic wants. They see sort of, they see from the river to the sea, very much all of Israel in control. Yeah, thank you for the question.
Victor asks that he would welcome your views as to whether there really is a partner or an individual who wants to recognize and really work with Israel, who carries the respect of the Palestinian street as well, and who Israel respects. So someone on either side. I guess really looking for a little bit of encouragement that there is a possibility of that happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. You're talking about from the Palestinian side, is there sort of someone? Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, this is sort of a question, and in Hamas, it's a police state in Gaza. There has been no way for like a real opposition to raise up. Journalists have been imprisoned, and protesters have been thrown into jail. Anyone who sort of protests Hamas. So it's hard to sort of know what sort of like the alternative is inside Gaza. Although it was interesting when you look at polling, there was a poll that came, that I think October 6th. In Gaza, inside Gaza, Hamas was dipping in popularity. It was rising in popularity in the West Bank, but it was dipping in Gaza. So you saw a real sort of discontent inside Gaza. And as these protests, brave people as they are right now, coming out now, even in time of war against Hamas, shows that some people have connected the dots. They, on the one hand, might see Hamas as sort of like the only people protecting them. And that's a way a lot of Palestinians feel like this is sort of their default army against Israel. On the other hand, they also connect the dots that, if October 7th had not happened, the savagery had not happened, Israel would not have come in so strongly in this sort of war that Israel, of course, sees as a war of self-defense. But of course, people in Palestine, but of course, many Palestinian people around the world feel like now it's become a war against Gazans themselves. And then there is in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority is long known for being corrupt, for being out of touch, for being quite authoritarian. And there are different streams of Palestinians that have been trying to sort of come up in the ranks for different young Palestinians. And then there is someone whose name you might recall, Marwan Barghouti. He's been recalled many times the Palestinian Mandela. I wouldn't quite go that far, but he is somebody who there has a pragmatic side. He's in prison for leading a brigade inside Fatah that was found responsible for the killings of several Israelis, and that's why he is in prison. But there's this sort of, theory sometimes that part of being in prison meant that he was kept alive, and that actually is not so different from the Mandela story, that he was sort of, by virtue of being in prison, he was not killed either by the apartheid regime while he was would have been an active member of the ANC outside. And so he has a very strong following. His wife, who's a lawyer, and has been sort of his voice outside of prison. She's done a very good job of sort of keeping his name out there. So that's another person to look for. I think, there are a lot of Palestinians who, like a lot of Israelis, just want their lives to be safe and secure, want their kids to grow up without, hiding from rocket fire and hiding from invasions of different kinds. So I think there is hope there for sure. I think it's, how to get to those people, how to empower them, how to make their voices heard, is part of this sort of idea of capacity building that would come as part of this Biden doctrine, is how to strengthen a new, renewed Palestinian Authority, which would probably mean throwing out a lot of the current leadership.
Thank you. A little bit more optimistic than I'd expected. So
yeah.
Thank you. So you were talking about the protests on the Saturday night, and you were also talking about the cafes being full. So with the cafes, do you get the feeling that part of that is what I was saying at the beginning about us and wanting to be connected and needing to be together and to show support, to give support? And the other part of that was, do you think the protests will now go back to just being political on the Saturday nights?
Yeah. So on the cafe side, I think it's, people just craving normalcy. I think people just craving, it took a while, but like now you can't get a restaurant reservation in Tel Aviv a week ahead of time. I mean, people just sort of, I can tell you, because I tried this week, and it's, people have sort of gone, it's sort of, I think, always been the sort of Israeli ethos. People sort of like, living on the edge. You don't know what's going to be tomorrow. So you have to sort of live your life to the fullest with all of the heartache of what's going on. I think for some people, it's still hard to go out and still hard out, to sort of be normal. There is this incredible dissonance, right? And it's really hard, I think, as a journalist, especially, and somebody who's, has Palestinian colleagues reporting from Gaza and in the West Bank, and hearing a different story. I mean, Israelis are also hearing a very different narrative. When I wake up and I hear, oh, I see a tweet about, or a message about 127 Palestinians killed yesterday. They're not seeing that, right, in their news feeds. They're not seeing that. And so it's a different reality, which I think makes it sort of easier to kind of go back to sort of some sort of abnormal normal. As for the protests, I feel like they are beginning to merge. I mean, I know there's a very clear decision by the hostage families early on to keep things separate because they did not want to step on the toes of the political leaders. They, this is their lives or their loved ones are in the hands of a few people, right? A few people, Sinwar, interestingly, is deep underground now. I mean, Israel is trying to close it in on him. I'm talking about Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in Gaza. He's been out of touch recently, the last few days, because he's so far underground, and that's perhaps could cause some issues with the negotiations because they don't really know what he's thinking, But so yeah, so they know that their hands, the life is in the hands of Sinwar and the other Hamas leaders and Netanyahu. So they don't want to piss off Netanyahu too much. But I think at this point they're realizing that perhaps their strategy of being polite has not served them well. I mean, I can't speak for them, right? But that's sort of what I'm beginning to sort of observe from the outside. And I'm sure there's also a division in thought, right? There's all kinds of hostage families. And actually, Netanyahu has been a master of divide and conquer. That has been the number one sort of rule of his game. He has also divided and conquered within the hostage families. He has hostage families that are more, I guess you would say, sort of on the right or more aligned with him, and those that are not. And he has had separate meetings with the groups of families, which I think is also part of the tragedy of this moment, is how politicized he has made and his minions has made the struggle, and also in sort of a backlash against the hostage families, if you were, as it were, and as we've seen in sort of very ugly debates in Knesset. And also, I can just sort of recount John Polin is a friend of mine. We went to college together. His son is Hirsch Goldberg Polin, who was 23, who I happened to have the distinct pleasure and joy of meeting and having dinner with just a week before he was kidnapped at a beautiful Sukkot dinner. And all of us, my whole family, we were so just smitten by Hirsch. He's effervescent and funny and smart and like lit up the entire table the entire time. We were devastated that he's in Gaza. And John had a video that he posted on the Bring Hirsch Home Instagram page and social media channels, which I encourage you all to follow because they're doing a very good job of keeping people engaged. He broke my heart. He said last week that he has all sorts of people coming up to him saying things like, we're with you, but there are 130, at the time, 136 hostages. And now there are, 9 million Israelis, and we have to think about them, and sort of buying this line that has been the sort of campaign that sort of, trying to play down the hostage, the urgency of the hostage return. So that was really hard to hear.
Thank you. That brings us beautifully to 9:30. I want to thank you even more so, having told me this morning you've been ill all week, that you were able to join us and be so lucid this morning and so erudite. Thank you really from the bottom of our hearts, because it makes us feel more part of what's going on there, and heartbreaking as it is, we need to be connected. I want to thank Richard Miron, which I forgot to do at the beginning, for connecting us in the first place. So Richard's a great friend of both of us. And I wish everyone a Shabbat Shalom, really of peace. I will be away myself next week for the first time since we started this. And my wonderful colleague Katie will be hosting the Friday with the executive director of the Abram Initiatives, someone I know well, so I feel they're both in good hands with each other and with you. And thank you all again for all your support. Thank you, Dina. I look forward to keeping in touch with you and hopefully seeing you in September.
Great. And I just want to just follow up if you'll be interviewing Tabet next week, right? Tabo Abaras. So I just want to make I have a interview I did with him that will be coming out shortly through the Alliance for Middle East Peace. I've written a series of profiles of peace activists in this time. It actually helps answer in some ways the earlier question of people who are working really hard despite really hard times to keep things together as much as possible, with the understanding that Palestinians aren't going anywhere, Jews aren't going anywhere. So I'll send a link, Judy, to that to you.
Thank you. I'll send it around with the email next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you.